In our third year of marriage, an unexpected pregnancy with our third child coincided with a jarring discovery: my husband's long-standing infidelities, a constant undercurrent since our wedding day. He just picked up a flashy red Beetle from the dealership, my best friend, Beatrice, chirped with undisguised glee. Who else would he buy that for? As year-end approached, Beatrice and I continued our tradition of salon appointments. Reclining side by side in the shampoo chairs, Beatrice twisted her head towards me. "Eleanor, you need to keep a closer eye on Julian. Robert mentioned seeing him at the car dealership, picking up a red Beetle. Robert didn't want me to say anything, but I had to warn you. That kind of car, who else could it be for? And those things aren't cheap. He's really going all out." Eyes closed, I simply hummed an acknowledgement, a sound lost in the salon's gentle hum. Beatrice, clearly dissatisfied with my muted response, sat up abruptly and playfully slapped my arm. "Don't take it so lightly. Julian isn't the same man he used to be. Robert says Metrocorp is booming, even established businesses like Robert's have to tread carefully around him now." She settled back into the chair with a sigh. "Oh, men," she scoffed, a hint of bitterness in her voice. "Their ambition only manifests in two arenas: career and women. Julian, with his suave demeanor and that wolf in sheep's clothing vibe, probably has women crawling out of the woodwork." My eyes remained shut, this time without even a hum. Silence hung in the air for a moment. Then, Beatrice sighed, her tone softening, more confiding now. "Honestly, I used to envy you, marrying so well. Husband handsome, successful. But now, I see the appeal of an ordinary man. Someone like Robert, useless at business, kind of plain-looking, spends his days fishing and birdwatching. Less to worry about." Still no response from me. Beatrice turned fully towards me. "In our circle, you and Julian were the anomaly, the love marriage. Made us all green with envy. But now, I think arranged marriages like ours are actually more stable. No initial romance, just external factors binding us. Harder to break. But you too, if the love fades, what's left?" I opened my eyes, met her gaze with a gentle smile, a silent agreement. Beatrice seemed satisfied. She relaxed back, urging the stylist to check on her hair treatment. After the salon, Beatrice and I shopped, had lunch, and then I picked up 4-year-old Toby from his after-school class, before heading home. Surprisingly, Julian was home early. He sat on the sofa, helping 6-year-old Charlie assemble a robot model. Charlie's twin sister, Clara, also 6, practiced piano in her room. I showered, dried my hair, changed into loungewear, and busied myself getting the children ready for dinner. The nanny was already in the dining room, overseeing the children. "You've eaten, right?" I asked Julian casually, tidying the scattered robot parts on the coffee table, then straightening the cushions the children had disarranged. "Oh, Toby's teacher mentioned a film director scouting for cute child actors. She wants to recommend Toby. Are we okay with that?" "I've been thinking," I continued, turning to Julian. "Toby's a natural performer, loves attention. It could be a good experience. The downside is the public exposure, potential privacy issues. What do you think?" It was then I realized it was the first time I'd truly looked at him since being home. Julian seemed to have been lost in thought, gazing at me. My sudden attention startled him, his eyes flickered away briefly before he replied, "I have no objections." "Your decision." He paused, then added, "I ran into Robert at the dealership yesterday, picking up a car." He seemed to want to explain further, but the words didn't come. He just watched me, an unreadable expression on his face. I was replying to the drama teacher on my phone. "Sorry, what?" "Oh, Beatrice told me," I said, glancing up from my screen. "I've replied to the teacher. We're happy to meet the director. Maybe dinner? Keep some evenings free after New Year, okay?" Julian hesitated, then nodded. "Okay." Clara and Charlie finished eating. I checked Clara's piano practice, told Charlie to get ready for his bath, and reminded the nanny to watch Toby's table manners. Julian sat quietly on the sofa, lost in thought. Catching sight of him amidst my flurry of activity, I suddenly felt he was encased in an invisible bubble, separate from me and the children. He seemed at leisure, yet a strange loneliness emanated from him. 5 minutes later, in Clara's room, listening to her play, Julian's mention of the car dealership resurfaced. I chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. I knew what Julian had hoped for. He wanted me to probe, to question him, perhaps even with a hint of jealousy or anger. But I couldn't. Not a pretense of indifference, but genuine apathy. My own coldness surprised even me. The woman I once was would have reacted very differently. Beatrice was right. Julian and I were indeed a rarity in our wealthy social circle, a marriage born of love. At least, for me, it was. In my 20s, I was a headstrong, love-obsessed heiress. From 14, I'd been infatuated with Simon, the eldest son of the Shin family, a hopeless, one-sided crush that led me to some undignified pursuits. Heartbroken, I drifted into a life of frivolous pursuits. My father arranged a marriage with George, the eldest son of the prestigious Quartermain family. I was indifferent. Marriage or not, it would be a life of separate spheres anyway. Then, I met Julian. At the time, the Jiang family's retail chain was a rising star in Beijing, still needing the support and introductions of established families. As a newcomer to the elite circle, Julian, by all accounts, should have been cautious, even subservient. Yet, he quickly integrated. He possessed an easy charm. Understated, humble, his words and actions always perfectly measured, leaving a pleasant impression. Men and women alike were drawn to him. He was unlike any wealthy heir I'd met, privileged, yet devoid of the typical arrogance or ostentation. I fell for him, inevitably and deeply. And Julian, with his gentle smiles, gracefully reciprocated my fervent affection. Those days were dizzying in their happiness. Before Julian, I'd always felt destined for a supporting role in life, never the lead. My beauty wasn't striking, my knowledge unremarkable, even my rebellious streak wasn't as dramatic as other heiresses. Yet, my taste in men was undeniably high. This meant finding mutual affection felt almost impossible. But, unexpectedly, Julian, admired by many women in our circle, singled me out. At every gathering, he sought me out, remembered my preferences, and when friends teased us about the budding romance, he'd look at me with tender, indulgent eyes. To be seen as unique in someone's eyes was intoxicating. It was a kind of exclusive adoration I'd never experienced. I was swiftly, completely, and irrevocably captivated. The Jiang family wasn't my father's ideal match. Compared to the Shen and Quartermain families, they were less established, their connections less extensive, offering limited advantages to the Yu family. But my resolve was unwavering, it was Julian or no one. My mother, however, approved. When choosing a man, always choose a smart one. Fools even do bad things stupidly, harming themselves in the process. Life with a fool is unbearable. Julian seems intelligent, knows what he wants. Looking back, perhaps my mother foresaw the future of this marriage. But I was too blinded by love to understand. My remarried father, newly blessed with a son, was in high spirits, less stringent with me. He didn't object. I rushed to tell my mother the good news. She watered her orchids, humming softly. Good mood? It's because he finally has a son, thinks the Yu family doesn't need to rely on you anymore, so he doesn't care. Eleanor, remember this, family is a woman's career. You must manage it well. And so, I married my beloved Julian, overjoyed. In the wedding video, I was constantly smiling, my gaze fixed on my handsome groom, happiness and devotion overflowing. When did things begin to change? For a long time after the wedding, I was happy, blissful. Julian was subtly mischievous, rarely showing his emotions, yet possessing an irresistible allure. His understated glances and whispers would often leave me blushing, playfully attacking him with mock fury. I both resented and adored him. Looking back, those days were saturated with affection, memories filtered through a honeyed lens, almost unreal. After our marriage, the Jiang family's retail business, riding on the coattails of the Yu family's real estate ventures, flourished. 2 years into our marriage, I gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl. Julian was ecstatic, his parents doted on me. Even my usually stern father offered a rare compliment. I was, as my mother put it, incredibly lucky, a life seemingly overflowing with flowers and gifts. The twins were entirely in the care of my in-laws, nannies, and childcare professionals. My biggest daily concerns were choosing a makeup style that would catch Julian's eye, deciding which carb blocker to take to indulge in lavish meals without gaining weight, and how to convince Julian to try the new escape room. In our 3rd year of marriage, I unexpectedly conceived our 3rd child. That same year, I stumbled upon Julian's secret world in his phone, a series of affairs that had been ongoing since our wedding. Superficial emotional investments in capable female subordinates, seemingly legitimate private dinners with female business partners, whispers of scandalous rumors with celebrity brand ambassadors. Objectively, compared to some notorious playboys, Julian's behavior might seem mild. But to me, it was devastating. I couldn't reconcile the fact that while my world revolved around him, he had ample time and energy for countless women. My cherished fairy tale of lifelong monogamy crumbled into the mundane reality of fleeting desires. The man I believed saw me as unique, now just saw me as a wife, no more, no less. I confronted Julian in tearful rages, nights became sleepless torment. I confided in my parents, appealed to my in-laws, even made 3 dramatic trips to the hospital, threatening abortion. But I couldn't go through with it. I just wanted to see Julian panic, regret. I loved him so fiercely. Loved him enough to hate his betrayal, yet one glimpse of him could still bring tears to my eyes. The last hospital visit was in the dead of night. That time, my argument with Julian was so intense, it triggered contractions, almost leading to a miscarriage. The elders of both families were alerted. My mother-in-law fainted from the shock, my father-in-law threatened to strike Julian. My father, however, was furious with me, deeming me childish, dramatic. Which man doesn't have some rumor swirling around him, he scoffed. My mother stayed with me in quiet support. When we were alone, she spoke with weary wisdom. Eleanor, when you chose a man like Julian, you should have known he wouldn't be content with just one woman. Exceptional and faithful men probably exist, but women like us aren't lucky enough to find them. Infidelity was a daily occurrence in the world. I wasn't the first to be heartbroken, the story was hardly original. I wept silently into my pillow. The spotlight of destiny had never shone on me. I was, and always would be, a supporting character, a background player. I stayed in the hospital for 2 weeks. Under my father's command and my mother's persuasion, I returned home. Julian brought the twins back from my in-laws. The children surrounded me, laughing and chattering. I hugged them tightly, forcing a smile through the heartache. That night, I lay in bed. Julian, with the nanny's help, settled the twins, then came to the bedroom. "Get out," I said coldly, back to the door. Julian sighed, sat on the floor by the door. Silence stretched. I glanced back, half expecting him to leave. Seeing him sitting there only fueled my anger. I said, "Get out." I hurled a pillow at him. He didn't flinch, just calmly placed it aside. I felt a sense of futility, like hitting cotton. A wave of despair washed over me, and I began to sob. After a long silence, when my sobs subsided, Julian finally spoke. "Eleanor, I thought, when we married, we were on the same page about what marriage meant." He pinched the bridge of his nose, eyes closed, his voice weary, tinged with regretful apology. My sobs stopped abruptly. I was confused, yet a chilling premonition, a sense of danger, began to coil around my heart. You know, when we got married, I overheard someone say, Eleanor, the perpetual spinster, finally found someone to marry in Julian. I thought you just wanted to find a reasonably good-looking man to marry. At least, in this marriage, we both got what we wanted, didn't we? Tears dried. I stared blankly, some truths, perhaps obvious to wiser women, now slowly dawning on me. Of course, when I chose you as my wife, besides Metrocorp's synergy with you property, your many virtues also appealed to me. You are simple, filial, traditional, easily content, love children, a perfect wife candidate. And you have proven to be exactly that. And I believe I've kept my promise, provided you with a comfortable life, a harmonious family. I think I've been gentle and considerate, and I've been dutiful to your parents and mine. As for those women you discovered. Julian ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration. I don't think you need to be concerned. I never actively pursued them. They were just. Because of certain circumstances, a few I didn't explicitly reject. Do you understand? Just social formalities. I'm not particularly interested in women, or love, or romance. So, rest assured, no one will ever threaten your position as Mrs. Jiang. I'd never jeopardize our family. If you have concerns, I can put more of my earnings in your and the children's names. I hope we can address this rationally, minimize internal friction, and maximize family interests. Does that sound acceptable? His words were so logical, so reasonable, making it seem unreasonable for a wife to object. But I felt as if I were submerged in ice water, the last warmth draining from my heart. This marriage, to which I'd poured all my love and devotion, was, for Julian, nothing more than a business transaction. The most ironic part was, he didn't even seem apologetic. I closed my eyes, smiled bitterly, two cold tears silently tracing paths down my cheeks. Please, just go, my voice was hoarse, barely a whisper. Julian watched me silently for a moment, then rose and left. He was so composed, so detached, a mere observer of my pain, filled with a detached pity. After Julian's that night, I couldn't stay at home. Heavy with emotion and pregnancy, I returned to my mother's. But my mother wasn't there. I called her. Her voice on the phone was strange, a forced sadness mixed with a barely concealed glee. Your father had a stroke, he's in intensive care. Doctors say it's not good. Your aunt and uncle don't know what to do, asked me to come discuss. I was alarmed. A stroke? How suddenly? Which hospital? What about Mrs. Cheen? My mother scoffed. Don't even mention that Mrs. Cheen. All her fault. A few days ago, at kindergarten checkup, they found Eric's blood type is O. Your father is AB, how could he have an O-type son? Had a paternity test. Eric is not related to him at all. The old fool raised another man's son for 3 years. My mother chuckled for a while, then said mockingly, I underestimated Cheen. That ambition, that audacity, not everyone has it. She beat Cheen up, my mother continued, but she wouldn't admit defeat, said blood relation doesn't matter, raising is raising. Said your father. Old and barely functioning, should be happy to have such a handsome son even if he didn't father him. Sent your father into a stroke in anger. My mother finished laughing, sighed with sardonic amusement. I really underestimated Cheen. That ambition and guts, not just anyone can have. You're heavily pregnant, hospital is crowded, don't come. Plenty of people here, my mother said curtly. Honey, you must make your marriage with Julian. Work, raise the 3 children well, help Julian grow his business, make mom proud. Let that old man who only wanted a son see who he can really rely on. My mother's voice, excited but laced with a subtle, deep-seated resentment, accumulated over years, ran deep. I numbly hung up. I understood my mother's years of humiliation and pain. Her fervent wish now, I couldn't ignore. Marriage, I realized, wasn't just about 2 people in love living together. It carried so many complex roles. My father was in ICU for a month. My mother told me that, to build an empire for Eric, my father had been aggressively investing, losing several projects, causing a cash flow crisis. The stroke was likely linked to that stress. His management style had always been autocratic. Now he was down, the company was rudderless, quickly showing signs of decline. During my time at my mother's, Julian seemed to think I was just resting at my parents' house. He called daily, casually, and sometimes brought the twins to visit. For my mother and the children's sake, I responded perfunctorily. I hadn't decided what to do about our marriage. One day, after Julian left, my mother suggested we talk to Julian about taking over the family business. I hesitated, shook my head. Metrocorp is expanding fast. Julian probably doesn't have the time or interest in this mess. My mother considered this, nodded. True, shouldn't put all our eggs in one basket. Later, she mentioned my uncle and cousin, Neil, had been visiting my father frequently, but I remembered they weren't particularly close before. My mother smiled dismissively. Your uncle sees your father's cheap son is gone, wants Neil to swoop in and take over. He can dream on. I understood my mother's sentiment. I didn't want to get involved. Mom, let's just stay out of it. My mother said nothing, patting my hand reassuringly. Illness struck like a landslide. Father left ICU, but his condition worsened, slipping into a coma. Surprisingly, my mother, setting aside past grievances, moved into the hospital, tending to him day and night, suctioning phlegm, bathing him. I worried about her, unable to help much in my pregnant state. I urged her, Mom, hire a nurse. You're not young, don't make yourself sick. My mother smiled faintly. Don't worry, not for nothing. Won't be long now. That night, my father entered his final hours. I called Julian. We rushed to the hospital. Father looked surprisingly better. My mother explained it was the final glow before death. Father said a few words to Julian and me, then asked to speak to me alone. I heard from Mr. Chen, you're thinking about divorce? Mr. Chen was our family lawyer. I hesitated, didn't answer. I had indeed consulted him about divorce. Father sighed, closed his eyes. I saw his disappointment. Even at the end, I was still letting him down. Tears welled. Eleanor, do you know why I always wanted a son? Not entirely about son preference. If you could be pragmatic, prioritize the big picture, instead of being so emotional, obsessed with petty romance, maybe I could trust you to take over. You feel wronged, neglected, so you want a divorce. Have you thought about your children, your parents after divorce? You and your mother aren't business-minded, you can't keep the company afloat. What will you live on then? Are you and your mother used to hardship? The 3 children are used to privilege. Even if Julian pays generous alimony, if he remarries, has more children, how much will be left for your children? Eleanor, if Julian were a drunk, abusive, abandoning husband, I'd support divorce. But he isn't. As a man, I tell you honestly, men like Julian are rare. Life is give and take, letting go, and cherishing. Father finished, voice trembling, just looked at me. Never had my distant father looked at me with such focused attention. Heart aching, I wept, grasped his hand. Dad, I understand. Don't worry, I'll listen to you. Father finally closed his eyes, breath faint. Call your mother in. Mother stayed in the room for a long time, until father took his last breath. She emerged, eyes red, but no tears. At father's funeral, I had a C-section, delivering our 3rd child, Toby. When Toby was a month old, father's inheritance was finalized. According to his will, the company was sold, the proceeds divided. I got half, mother 1/8, uncle, aunt, and cousin each 1/8. My share was designated as my sole inheritance. Mother gave her share to me. When your father first went to the hospital, he made a will. In that will, your and your cousin's shares were reversed. She smiled at me. This is the value of my 4 months in the hospital, day and night. Holding Toby, I stared at my mother, shocked. Eleanor, love is for youthful dreams. Once married, with children, whoever is good to my children, I love them. Understand? Mother cooed at Toby, her tone light. I followed her gaze to Toby. His dark eyes wide, toothless grin for me. When Toby was 3 months old, I moved back home with Julian. When Julian came home that day, I was organizing my and Toby's things, calmly, methodically. The twins buzzed around Toby's crib, peering at the baby, peppering me with questions. I answered gently, patiently. Hearing the nanny announce "Sir's home," I turned, offered Julian a faint smile. "You're back?" Without waiting for his reply, I resumed my tasks. I felt his gaze linger on me. "Is it just been too long? You seem different." "But I can't place it," he murmured, a tentative smile. I returned his smile, didn't speak. I knew the difference he sensed was that the Eleanor who'd been consumed by him, whose joys and sorrows were written on her face, whose emotions swayed with his, was gone forever. That night, the twins were boisterous until late, finally falling asleep reluctantly. Toby was with the nanny. Only Julian and I remained in the bedroom. I was engrossed in my tablet, reviewing trust documents from Mr. Chen. Julian sat on the bed, a rare awkwardness about him. Finally, I finished, put the tablet down. I heard from Mom and Dad, Metrocorp's opened several new stores, large cash flow. I have a suggestion, are you interested? Nearly 5 years married, it was the first time I'd offered business advice. Sure, go ahead, Julian replied quickly, with, or maybe I imagined it, a hint of surprise, even eagerness. I have some cash, not satisfied with any trusts. I want to invest in Metrocorp, shares in the children's names. Agree? I looked at Julian. A wry smile playing on my lips. Although, to you, all young children are family, I still want to secure a little more for my children. My meaning was clear. It was the first time since our argument I directly addressed our rift. I kept my tone light, but a sharp edge was undeniable. Julian seemed embarrassed, a flicker of irritation. His tone defensive. Eleanor, I said, your and the children's position is unshakable. No need for such sarcasm. I smiled. So, I take that as a yes? Of course, Julian's tone was stiff, almost defiant. They are my children too. I'll double the shares. I smirked, got up to apply lotion at the vanity. Julian was silent, then asked, this money, your father left it to you? Yes, I didn't hide it, a self-deprecating tone. No choice. His daughter is useless, can't manage a company, no other skills, old father had to resort to the simplest way, leave money for her and his grandsons. I smiled casually, applying lotion to my arms, carefully controlling my trembling lips, but tears still glistened in my eyes. I was disappointed in myself. Despite my efforts, my voice was laced with sarcasm, and I couldn't suppress the sadness, the vulnerability. Julian watched me silently, a hint of tenderness in his eyes. I heard him sigh almost imperceptibly, then he rose, came behind me, wrapped his arms around me, whispering, why pretend strength in front of me? Cry if you want. Head lowered, I smoothed the last bit of lotion on my forearm, looked up at him in the mirror, flashed a flawless smile. Thank you. I believed I'd appeared calm, composed. But something in Julian seemed to snap. His arms tightened, he turned my face, kissing my ear and neck, his breath quickening. I tilted my head back, watched us in the mirror. His eyes were half closed, expression intent, jaw tight, fully aroused. I smiled sadly at myself, gently closed my eyes. That night, only Julian found release. Perhaps it was pent-up desire, he was almost feverish, more passionate than even our honeymoon. In contrast, my body was stiff, unresponsive. I knew Julian could feel my forced compliance, my inability to recapture the tenderness and passion of the past. Afterwards, Julian caressed my shoulder, kissed my hair. I felt his regret, and his tolerance. I knew what he thought. I had emotional baggage. Time would heal, we'd repair our relationship. For a moment, I almost believed it too. But from then on, I remained emotionally numb. My life centered on the children and my mother. Clara was quiet, studious, loved piano and calligraphy. Charlie was mischievous, destructive, dismantling every toy, disliking all classes except drones and robots. Toby, an extrovert, thrived in street dance, drama, basketball. I structured their lives, balanced academics and extracurriculars, each child flourishing in their own way. I enrolled my mother in senior college, convinced her to join a senior model team. She was always rehearsing or performing, radiating vitality. Even my in-laws received thoughtful care. Regular family visits, carefully chosen gifts for every occasion. I deepened my connections with my social circle, adept at networking, flattering, extracting valuable business intelligence from the wife's gossip, passing it on to Julian. I had finally become the perfect Mrs. Jeong, impeccable, irreplaceable. When Toby was 2, Metrocorp entered the Hong Kong market. Julian returned from a business trip, quarantined in a Shenzhen hotel due to the pandemic. Then, my mother-in-law had a sudden heart attack, rushed to the hospital. Doctors issued a critical condition notice, requiring bypass surgery. During the pandemic, the hospital only allowed one family member to stay, no substitutions. My father-in-law was elderly, incapable of caregiving. Hiring a nurse for an unconscious patient felt unreliable. From finding a top surgeon, to discussing treatment plans, to relentless bedside care, it all fell on me. 3 weeks later, Julian returned from Shenzhen. Mother-in-law had successfully recovered and been discharged. That evening, returning home from dinner at my in-laws, after putting the children to bed, I took my pajamas to shower, already drowsy. Seeing Julian still in his suit, I yawned, so late, haven't showered yet. Julian pulled me into a tight embrace. Instinctively, I resisted slightly. His grip tightened, his face buried in my hair. I felt a primal discomfort. I hadn't washed my hair that day. "Eleanor, have I ever thanked you?" Julian murmured after a long embrace. I paused, then smiled faintly. "We're family, no need for thanks." "Oh, right," I pushed him away, looked up. "Beatrice wants to open a member-only ballroom dance club near her place, wants me to invest." I looked into it. The neighborhood is full of white-collar professionals and newly rich homeowners, shouldn't lack customers. Beatrice has danced for years, semi-professional. Seems promising. I want to try. If Mr. Jeong really wants to thank me, maybe sponsor some startup capital? I looped my arms around his waist, tilted my head playfully. Julian gazed at me intently, a faint smile. "All right." I kissed his cheek quickly. "Thanks, husband." I was trying too hard to play the gold digger, even knowing my performance was clumsy. Happily, I called Beatrice. Julian stood silently, rooted to the spot. I guessed he now understood what it felt like to offer genuine affection and be slapped in the face with cold, calculated practicality. For a long time after that, we existed in a strange limbo. Julian tried to bridge the subtle chasm between us, seeking genuine connection. I remained evasive, deflecting, avoiding intimacy. The dance club opened successfully. Beatrice, to attract wealthy female clientele, hired handsome male instructors, including a tango teacher from Argentina, Santino, supposedly a renowned tango dancer. I was just an investor, uninvolved in management, only occasionally stopping by. One day, visiting the main studio to find Beatrice, I arrived as a tango class ended. Students lingered, reluctant to leave, surrounding Santino, seeking guidance. The tall, foreign man spotted me, moved towards me with dance steps, seized my hand, spun me rapidly, ending in a dramatic dip. Blinded by the sudden whirl, suspended backwards, I instinctively grabbed his arm. Students applauded. Santino helped me up, smiling. Such a flexible back, a shame not to learn tango. I was annoyed, but kept it in check. I forced a smile, and left the studio. We met several times later, at club events and year-end parties. I wondered why Beatrice kept inviting me. She smiled knowingly. Someone asked me to, that Argentine, he's smitten with you. I glanced towards the foreigner. He was raising a wine glass to his lips, his light brown eyes fixed on me. I casually looked away, frowning at Beatrice. What are you doing? Are you crazy? Beatrice, tipsy, giggled. What's the harm? Just a bit of fun. You think your Julian is being faithful outside? She leaned closer. That foreigner looks like he knows how to have fun, tall, strong, passionate, dancing all day, definitely good stamina. What, are you really being celibate for Julian? You too, how often even now? After years of friendship, I knew Beatrice's envious, catty nature. Sisters nonetheless, I wasn't interested in judging her morals. I just smiled, changed the subject. Party over, Beatrice declined my offer to drive her home, loudly urging Santino to escort me instead. I had to help the tipsy Beatrice into her car, instructed the driver to drive carefully, and called Robert. Hanging up, I realized everyone else had left. Only Santino remained, still close. He clearly thought he had a chance, smiled suggestively, stepping closer. I didn't want to engage. Late at night, a bit wary. I hurried to my car, got in, slammed the door in his face. Driving away, I relaxed, Beatrice's words echoed. I sighed softly. Julian and I weren't infrequent, but I hadn't enjoyed it for a long time. My heart was cold, my body struggled to respond. Yet, the idea of having fun with someone other than Julian was still unacceptable. I remembered asking my mother why she never remarried. Her smile was weary. Your father was a bastard, but having seen so many men, no one compares. I laughed ruefully. Now, I understood my mother. It wasn't about that man anymore. It was about not cheapening myself. Clara finished her piano practice. I pulled myself from memories, hugged my daughter, praised her specifically. Busy until late, the children finally asleep. Back in the bedroom, the club called, saying Robert was causing trouble, smashing the place, hitting Beatrice. The line was filled with shouting. The receptionist's voice trembled. I rubbed my forehead. Year-end approaching, what a mess. I grabbed my coat. Julian picked up his car keys. I'll go with you. I glanced at him, hesitated, then nodded. At the club, through the glass, we saw the brightly lit lobby. Beatrice, wrapped in a blanket, hair disheveled, screamed at Robert. Can't last 3 minutes in bed, still have the nerve to accuse me of cheating. We agreed to play around. Why do you care? Eleanor sleeps around too, but Julian doesn't bat an eye, that's a real man. I rolled my eyes. This woman was impossible. Julian turned to me, expressionless. Robert lunged, slapped Beatrice. His friends wrestled him back, panting, you still have the nerve to talk. That foreigner just confessed, he hit on me first, failed, then used you for release and pocket money. You think you're so desirable, you idiot. Julian glanced at Santino, pinned in a corner, face darkening, about to push open the door. I stood rooted, suddenly weary. I'm going home, I turned towards the steps, no explanation. Julian stared, face grim, then turned, strode after me, getting into the driver's seat. He didn't speak, driving like a maniac. Julian's anger lasted until we got home. He slammed the door, pushed me against the wall, his kisses were brutal, almost biting. Afraid to wake the nanny and children, I struggled, pushed him away, angrily. Julian scooped me up, carried me to the bedroom, dropped me on the bed. I sat up, hair disheveled, glaring. What's wrong with you? Julian ripped off his coat, pinned me down, silencing me with his mouth. The lovemaking was like a battlefield. Finally, exhausted, I gave up, stared at the ceiling, wearily said, "If you suspect me, divorce me. No need to torment me." Julian held me tight, face buried in my neck. "I don't suspect you. I know you're not interested in other men." Julian sneered, looked down at me. "You hate me, don't you? You haven't gotten over it for 4 years, right? Think I'm dirty?" His voice rose. "What do you want from me? Have I done anything wrong since then? I never touched those women." He threw Toby's toy off the bed, hitting the wall hard. My eyes were still closed, but my heaving chest betrayed my ragged breaths. Silence descended, broken only by Julian's heavy breathing. He sat up, silent, then ran a hand over his face, rose, put on his pants, grabbed his coat and left. 2 days later was New Year's Eve. My in-laws and mother were celebrating at our house. Many relatives and friends would visit. I was swamped, from elders' entertainment to children's new clothes, to food, drinks, red envelopes, snacks. The night of our argument, Julian didn't come home. Next day, he returned, calm, casual. Even helped with household chores. New Year's Eve, Nanny and I were in the kitchen preparing the feast. Father-in-law wrote spring festival couplets. Mother and mother-in-law chatted, watched TV. The children, finally anticipating nightfall, clamored for fireworks. Beijing had banned fireworks for years, New Year spirit fading. This year, to please the children, Julian bought electronic fireworks. He chose the safest, simplest ones, taught Charlie how to use them. The children happily set them off on the balcony. Electronic fireworks couldn't compare to real ones. But the children, never knowing better, were thrilled. I followed to the balcony. "Be careful. Let Dad light them, don't do it yourselves." The children mumbled agreement. Charlie winked at Dad behind my back. Turning back to the kitchen, Julian pulled me into his arms. "Busy? Watch for a bit." The children shouted, "Mom, look." I had to stay. Julian held me gently, nuzzling my hair. "About the other night, sorry." I didn't answer. After a while, shook my head, body unconsciously relaxing. "I was scared that night," Julian continued, voice calm, a desperate honesty. "I realized if you really had another man, I couldn't handle it." Children were shouting excitedly. Thankfully, I could pretend to watch them, avoiding Julian's gaze. "Eleanor, I don't know if you feel it, but I love you. Not old couple habit, not just family, but deeper love and attraction. I love watching you, seeing you around the house, seeing you manage everything, seeing you smile at the children. I enjoy being with you, even when you don't talk, even when you ignore me. Eleanor, I'm sorry my feelings came late. But I hope you can face them, try to accept them, give our love another chance. The rest of our lives are decades long. A marriage of love is better than a hollow one, right?" I watched the electronic fireworks. After a long silence, I laughed self-deprecatingly. "These electronic fireworks are weird, unnatural, like me." Julian frowned, about to speak, but I interrupted. "Remember when I first married you? Always laughing, crying, love-struck, naive, so stupid, right? But that was the real me. Though I've completely abandoned her. You like me now because I'm rational, calm, shrewd, fitting your ideal wife. I don't blame you for not loving me as I hoped, from the start. But you did use a false marriage to trade for my true heart, without warning. But I get it now. Julian, we are both ordinary. You traded marriage for profit, and I couldn't be noble and break everything. I understand you, and I'll stay with you. But for us ordinary people, let's not expect pure, noble love anymore." My voice was light, with a sense of resigned amusement, a sigh. The doorbell rang. Nanny went to open it. First wave of New Year visitors arrived. The living room instantly buzzed. The elders rose to greet them. The children ran to play with their friends. I pulled Julian's arm from my waist, hurried to greet the guests. Julian stood alone on the dimly lit balcony, his gaze fixed on me, as he had countless times before. And as countless times before, I deliberately ignored his gaze, focusing on greeting guests, being warm, gracious, perfect hostess. Guests were seated. The host was still missing. Too rude. I glanced at the balcony, met Julian's gaze. Deep, lonely. Hiding a bitter resignation, and a lingering tenderness. Seeing my reproachful look, he smiled, walked towards the living room. I looked down, composed myself. His smile, gentle and accepting, made my heart soften for a moment. Was it cruel to keep the person he loved so close, yet forever out of reach? But I quickly dismissed the thought. He'd scorned sincerity, casually traded love for gain. Lacked patience, failed to wait for time to polish the jade. This was the best punishment for a Philistine who profaned love. Children finally lit the biggest firework. The balcony erupted in color. I calmly directed the seating, smiling at the spectacle. One side, romantic fireworks, the other, mundane life. The rest of my life vast, from now on, everything is mine, free and content. The end.